So we can see the
Sorry about
welcome
that.
slides now.
Yes, the welcome slide. It's whether it moves on is the key thing. So we've gone on to online housekeeping.
It hasn't yet.
So nothing, you can't see, you can just see welcome, yeah?
We can, yeah.
We can. Okay, hang on again, sorry.
Aha, now we've moved. Agenda.
Agenda, okay, see if it moves now. Does it, are you still there? Agenda?
Still on agenda, yes.
Does the first bullet point come up?
It's got all the bullet points.
The reference.
Yeah, we can see all the bullet points.
All the bullet points, okay.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, apologies there for that slight technical start. Just sometimes it doesn't quite render as it should do, but please, if there is a problem, either put something in the chat box, or Andrew, you can shout out. So yes, so today's talk is around assessment of writing, and we're going to talk really around how writing is assessed within PTE General. Now, the approach I'm going to take here, and you can see from the agenda, is really looking at it in a top-down, bottom-up type of perspective. Okay, so I'm going to look at the Common European Framework of Reference, which the CFR, which many people will be familiar with, which describes in general terms what people are supposed to do or supposed to be able to do in terms of their writing at different levels, and also gives some quite specific information about levels of achievement within the Common European Framework. So we'll look at that. Then we're going to look at the construct of writing. Now, this is broadly reflected in the Common European Framework, but specifically for PTE General, what is the test trying to test?
Apologies, David. It looks like some people are having difficulties seeing the slides. I think that perhaps we need to share presenter's view, is the advice that's coming from Carmen.
I think I need to share presenter's view.
I think so.
You mean? Maybe share presenter's view.
That seems to have done it. I think that's working.
Well, you can just see, okay, so that's fine. I mean, so you can see the other slides as well.
Yeah.
It must be that the full screen is not working. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is a slide I've just been talking about. So we'll be looking at the GSE, the Global Scale of English, in terms, again, of the higher level, the top-down approach. What are the learning objectives related to the writing that we're talking about, the construct of writing? And also focusing on grammar and vocabulary. Now, this is very much the bottom-up approach. So writing is an interesting skill in that, of course, you have to have the knowledge and the understanding of language, and you have to be able to do things with the language and do things with the written language. But also, there's a big focus on accuracy and range. So we'll be looking at how we can help students with their grammatical range and accuracy, and how we can help them with their vocabulary. Similarly, we'll be looking at some courseware mapping, some books, and how they have been mapped to the test. And again, this is to support the learning and teaching of writing at those different levels. The last section is tips. I put it as tips. So this again is learning and teaching, but this is more related to tips for the actual test itself. So we're focusing here really on supporting learners and teachers in developing writing skills. Now, what I'm not going to deal with explicitly, I've got one slide on this, is the test itself and how the test is marked. I will focus on the test tasks. I'm going to look at test tasks, but not on the marking criteria in great detail. Now, that's partly because that's been covered already in a previous seminar, and some people may have already been to that, so I didn't want to spend too much time on that area. Those recordings will be available of those seminars as well, so it can be referred to. Also, the PTE General Score Guide has got a good explanation of how scoring works. But what I will do, particularly in the Q&A, if people have specific questions about scoring, then I'm more than happy to address those. So if people do have questions, then please do put them in the Q&A or the chat box, as Andrew suggested, and then we will deal with those scoring questions towards the end. So in terms of looking at writing, I think the best approach to look at writing is, as I say, from both the top down and the bottom up. So in terms of the top down, we're looking at language frameworks. So things that tell us about general competency in language and how the skills, in this case writing, fits in with that general framework. So the general framework that was used in the development of PTE General, PTE General is quite an old test. I mean, it's been around for about 40 years, I think, 30 or 40 years. But it was redeveloped about 10 years ago. When it was redeveloped by Pearson, we basically used the Common European Framework as the basis for that redevelopment. And I've got a little question for you here. I hope you can see the question. So when was the original Common European Framework book published? So you can see I've put the Common European Framework book there. When was it published? You've got 1981, 1991, 2001 or 2011. I'll give you a second there to pick your answer. So many of you who've been involved in the Common European Framework for a long time will know that that it started to be developed in the 90s, and in the early 90s there was documentation around advantage and wastage and the threshold level, which was the first level to come out, and that was really towards the end of the 80s, early 90s. But this actual publication, the book itself, was published in 2001. And if you look actually on the front of the book, you can see it was published at the same time as the European Year of Languages. And of course, this is something that most people recognize, that the Common European Framework of Reference is used for all languages. It's a European-wide documentation that was supposed to be applicable to all major language groups. As I say, the revised version of PTE General came out about 10 years ago, and that was after work, and all the work was based on the Common European Framework. Now, the Common European Framework has three basic levels, A, B, and C. I think people will be familiar with those. And then within those levels, they're split into a lower and a higher level, so A1 and A2. As you'll see later when we're talking about textbooks, some people also split out A2, because A2 is quite a long level in terms of learning. So people have A2 and A2 plus. But the A levels we can see, and if you look at the table here, this is taken from the self-assessment grids in the Common European Framework, and it describes really what people can do at those particular levels in any language actually, but in this case we're talking about English. So the key, if you're looking up for the key elements of basic user, then you'll see the words that I've highlighted: short, simple, notes and messages, a very simple personal letter at A2, thanking someone. So you can see that you're starting at A1, you've just got some very, very simple nouns that will be very familiar to that person because it's all about themselves. A2, starting to move into some very basic functional language, but everything very simple and very short. B level, which is often characterized as the independent user. So this is when the learner has been able really to start learning on their own much more. They still often do have go to school, and many people on this call will be teaching people in B levels. Again, B1 and B2, relatively long levels. People think of this sometimes as the plateau, where people are, and often B1 is split now into B1 and B1 plus, and B2 is B2 and B2 plus. A lot of learners in this area making progress through their language learning. And we can see that B1 is actually still similar in a way to the A level. With writing, writing skills develop at a slightly slower pace than some of the other skills. And you can see at B1, you can see it's simple connected text, familiar and personal interest. So again, similar to what was at A level. Can write personal letters. So this is a longer, the expectation is they can write more. describing experiences and impressions. So still a lot of it is writing about themselves, but it's an extended text type, an extended number of functions, and also, if you're talking about experiences and impressions, notions. B2 is a step again. So you can imagine in B1, people developing quite a lot of their writing skills. In B2, they are supposed to then be able to write clear, detailed text on a wide range of subjects, essays or reports, support or against arguments, write letters highlighting personal significance of events and experiences. So at the B2 level, clearly this is a much more competent user in terms of writing. And you can see there you'd expect them to be able to deal with a wide range of subjects and also use a number of different formats. And this will be reflected in the test material. C level, proficient user. Here we're talking about a very high level of proficiency, and the word that comes out here that should jump out here is complex. So it's complex in terms of language, structure, vocabulary, and also a much wider range of text types. So you can see at C1, there mentions there a letter, essay, report. It also talks about selecting the appropriate style for a reader. At C2, it talks about summaries and reviews of professional or literary works. So this level of language at the C level, and particularly C2, is really a professional use of English language, or the language involved, not really just not a learner language at that level. So how does this help us? Well, as I said, in terms of PTE General, PTE General has 6 levels: foundation, level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and those tests were all designed to be aligned with the Common European Framework levels. So we've taken the descriptors from the Common European Framework, the descriptors of writing competence at those different levels, and they are mapped to the tests. So the tests are designed to pull out those key features at A1, A2, B1, B2, and at the C levels as well. And also for those people who did attend the seminar on how the writing section is marked, they will know that the marking criteria is based on the Common European Framework levels. So the marks are all related to how well the test taker matches those particular Common European Framework levels. So that's the basis of the test and how the test was developed from that larger body of work in the Common European Framework. But what is specifically being tested in PTE General? Now, an interesting aspect in terms of test construct is the fact that PTE General uses integrated skills tasks. So there are 2 tasks which involve writing. The part 2 of the test is an integrated skills dictation type activity where the student listens to some text and then writes it down. So this is integrating the skills of listening and writing. And in the written part, and later in the written test, part 7 and 8, part 7 is a reading activity where people read a bit of information and make notes on it, so note taking. And then that leads into a writing task where they have to write to somebody, using the information that they've got from the reading. So this is a read into write is often how it's explained in test terminology, read into write task. Now, integrated skills is common enough in classrooms, and many people here, classroom teachers, will use this and be very familiar with integrating listening and reading skills or reading and writing skills, and in terms of giving people a purpose and a reason to read or a reason to listen and a reason to write. The integrated skills is integrated into much of the learning materials that we have available. It's less common in testing, and so certainly PTE General is ahead of other tests in that respect. So integrated skills is important, but the main 2 focuses from the Common European Framework are written interaction and written production. So those are the 2 things that are being tested in PTE General. Written interaction is tested in part 8, and written production is tested in part 9. Apologies for the background noise. There's some thunder and a storm outside, if you can hear that. So what is written interaction? So the whole point of written interaction is that it's not just writing, presenting a story or a set of information on a page. It's a piece of writing which is expected, in which you're expecting to get a response. So you're writing as an act of communication, interacting with somebody to get a response from them. So classically, notes, memos, notes are still obviously on a personal level, are still common things to do. Memos, less so in the business level, the business situation. Memos have really been superseded by email. And I know people here will know that if you get email is often used as an interactive communication. People sending email expect a response, sometimes just a recognition that you've got it. Sometimes there are threads, email threads, which have got a number of different contributions from different people relating to the topic. Depending on the level of interaction or speciality, the people will contribute different things to that conversation. So email is very much written interaction, as is social media, texting. So things like Facebook, WhatsApp, Snapchat, all these applications which on telephones, which enable you to really interact in a written way with other people. There's more complex written interaction functions, which are really when you're negotiating a text. So this might be an agreement, or certainly something where you're not just signing an agreement, but where you have some input and where you can change things. And then there may be some written interaction around that. But certainly, given the last 20 years in terms of technology, since the Common European Framework document was published, the focus on written interaction has become more important, I think, in recent times, with a lot of email and social media taking up a lot of time, both personally and in a professional context. So written interaction, these are the descriptors from the Common European Framework in terms of what is expected of the students at different levels, and in terms of the written interaction. You can see at the B level, they convey information and ideas in abstract as well as concrete topics. Okay, check information, ask about to explain problems with reasonable precision. So here we're looking at functional. Some of this is quite functional in terms of what those written communications are trying to do. But as I say, in terms of things like email, etc., then it can become much more involved and related to to people's specialities and to their knowledge of a particular work situation, for example. The A level, you can still see short personal details, very limited in terms of what can be achieved at that level, according to the CFR descriptors. So let's look at that then. Let's look at, so that this is what we're expecting people to be able to achieve, and then let's look at how the test tries to do that and tries to get a sample of somebody's writing to see whether they can achieve that those particular outcomes. So here we can see this is from an A2 test, level 1. Section 8, as I said, Section 8 is the written interaction piece, and the candidate has read Section 5, which is about Oakwood Film Studios, some information about a film studio, and then they have to write an email to a friend. Okay, so they're using information from a reading, they're writing an email to their friend as a part of written interaction. They're expecting their friend to reply to that written piece of work. Okay, so very much writing as communication, functional invitation. And here's the sample answer. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to read that. Okay, the sample answer, the way in which these sample answers are written, and it's quite interesting in many respects, is they're written to give you an idea of the kind of range of vocabulary and the range of grammatical structures. You'll notice there's no errors, no grammatical errors in this, which is fine. It's not a student's answer, it's a sample answer. But it's interesting to see what the expectation is in terms of range of vocabulary and range of grammatical structure. Now, as I said, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the section 9, this is again is level 1, so the A2. Section 9 is looking at written production. And here you can see it's not transactional. You're not asking, people are not producing, it may be that the text will be read by someone. The first example here, for example, is a diary entry. Now that may be read, but it may only be read by yourself. It may not be read by anybody else. Similarly, the second one is a story. It's writing about someone's holiday. Again, it's not a transactional piece of work, but this is an interest. This is the different type of task associated with writing production. And again, there you should be able to see the sample answers there. So it'll just give you a couple of seconds to read through those. Again, just showing those to say that the focus when we're looking at candidates' responses, the focus. This is appropriate in terms of the type of text that you'd expect to get from a candidate, and looking at the range of vocabulary and the range of grammatical structures. Then you can see what is expected at this particular level. But in terms of accuracy, it's not really reflected in the sample answer. So those are some ideas about, ideas. I mean, they are some examples taken from the test to show the types of tasks that are going to be that are appropriate at each level. Those are selected based on the Common European Framework descriptors and what the expectations are of a student at that level. However, what we want to look at is what are the resources that are available for teachers. So whilst we can see what the expectations are for the candidates, how can a teacher prepare lessons or prepare courses that will focus the students on those requirements? So it's easy enough to say, we want you to do this, but how do we get from this is the requirement to this is how we can get our students to that point? So there are a couple of resources which I want to highlight. For those people who came to my reading seminar, I did look at what's called the Global Scale of English, which is a Pearson free resource, which you can find online. There's a database called the Teacher Toolkit, and if you Google Teacher Toolkit Pearson, because it's better to put Pearson in there because there's another Teacher Toolkit, but if you Google Teacher Toolkit Pearson, then you'll get access to that free resource. And it's a very helpful resource from both the perspective of a kind of top-down approach to writing and also a bottom-up approach. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. So when you're looking kind of a top-down, well, what can I teach and what's appropriate for this particular level of student? The Teacher Toolkit allows you to search for learning objectives, can-do statements, which are appropriate to different levels. So the global scale of English is split up into, it goes from 10 to 90, but that alongside that goes along with Common European Framework ranges. And you can see in this slide, although it'd be better in the bigger picture, you can see there are the Common European Framework levels as well. So you can select, for example, the type of learner. So here I've selected adult. I've selected a level, which is in fact the A2 level, both A2 and A2 plus, and I've selected writing. So I can select those and look at, well, what should people be learning in this particular range, this range of ability in their area of writing. And if we click on show results, which is the button there, it comes up with a list. And here you can see there are a list of 70 can-do statements. And these 70 can-do statements give you an idea about what people should be learning at different levels. And if you can see, I'm sorry, it's a bit small because it's not at the high. Actually, I can make it bigger, actually. So you can see there in the GSE column, it has a number there, which allows you to see exactly what level these different can-do statements are at. And also, if you look on the top one, you can see a little arrow pointing down. If you click on those arrows, it gives you the grammatical functions which are appropriate and which go with that particular can-do statement. So you've got the high level, which is what the students are expected to do at a particular level. And you've also got the grammatical functions, which either you can look at in terms of your teaching material, or you can look at in terms of course books, but it gives you a good idea about what kinds of grammatical structures need to be learnt in order to be able to perform that learning objective successfully. And similarly, I mean, there were 70 of these, so I picked out a couple more. This is A2 plus, so slightly higher. And you can see here for both for interaction and production, they're not split in that way on this database, but for both interaction and production, you can see can-do statements and the related grammar that's needed to teach those. So the GSE and the toolkit are very, very useful tools if you've got classes at particular levels, you're thinking about what elements of writing you want to teach them, or even just cross-referencing things which are already in the course book and to see what other things may be related to that at that level. So it can be used for supplementary, it can be used for remedial, you've got, or indeed for course planning. And similarly, as I said, there's a bottom-up aspect. So the toolkit gives you the ability to search grammatical forms. So here, for example, at the same level, A2 level, we're looking at nouns, what nouns are useful, the formation of nouns, mass and count nouns, plural, possessives. So we can look at, there's 13 results in terms of grammatical areas that students at A2 should focus on in relation to nouns. And again, you can download those or show the results on the screen. Vocabulary is similar. You can search keywords, individual words, or groups of words related to different topics that you might be teaching. And this is the bottom-up element. So the can-do statement tells you the overall aim, and the grammar and the vocabulary is there to give the students the tools to achieve those writing outcomes. If you do go onto that website, the Teacher Toolkit or the GSC website, you know, there's lots of information on there, and also lots of things about what other people have done, practical uses for the Teacher Toolkit, lessons, and the video introducing it and telling people more about it. So I would certainly encourage people, if they're interested, if they haven't done so already, to have a look at that. Resource. And similarly, if you look at the PTE General website, which again was featured in some of the earlier presentations, there's some good information about courseware. So how the examination sections and the examination construct is linked to the books that people publish and the sections of the books and the activities within them. So, for example, one of the Pearson course books, Cutting Edge, very relatively popular course book, particularly for adults and young adults, and at various levels. I've just pulled out here the B1 course book correlation, but there's A2, B1, B1 plus B2, a number of different levels there. And in this, in the correlation, which you find on the PTE General website, it gives you the what people are aiming for, the can-do statements. What the construct of the test is, written production or written interaction, and how that's worked, how that is developed in the course book itself. So that's for cutting edge. There's a number, that's about 8 or 10 different course books. So it should be the course book which you are familiar with on the website. These are 2 popular ones which I've just pulled. So Activate, another popular course book, again at different levels. This one is just at the B2 level. Again, it's got written production, creative writing, reports and essays. So showing that at B2, as I mentioned, a wider range of task types are required in order to complete the test. Okay, so as I said, I wanted to look at it from kind of a top-down, bottom-up perspective. So the top-down is the can-dos, the Common European Framework, and the bottom-up is the grammar and vocabulary competence that needs to go alongside that. So we looked at written interaction, which is, as I say, using writing for a communicative function to interact with someone to get a response. Another common, the other element of the construct which is being tested, which is tested in part 9 of the test, is written production. So here you can see a number of different examples of what written production involves. So these are very familiar to you. Obviously, some are more relevant at different levels. So we had articles and reports, which are relevant to the higher level. Messages can be at any level, really. Making notes depends on what the notes are. At the very basic level, it will be a short note. At a higher level, it might be notes on a meeting. Writing personal letters, again, relevant at the lower levels, as long as it's short. But business letters will be higher. Creative and imaginative writing, again, tends to come in at higher levels. So these are all examples, but as we looked at earlier in the descriptors, and in fact, sorry, apologies, as we can see here in the descriptors, the actual types of text are actually different depending on the level. I mean, there's nothing much at A1 there, but I just moved it up a little bit. So again, we can see if we look at the tests, if we look at B1, then we should expect straightforward connected text on a range of familiar subjects. If we look at B2, we should find a variety of subjects related to his or her field of interest, synthesizing and evaluating information and arguments from a number of sources. So we find at the B2 level this idea of evaluating information arguments. So again, more higher level cognitive and linguistic processes than we get at the B1. So there is certainly a distinction between the B1 writer and the B2 writer in this respect. This example, which I didn't put a heading on, but actually this comes from a level 3 test, so a B2 test. And again, we're looking the first, this exemplifies the fact that people are asked to write more different types of text, so a much wider range of text. So question 48 is a review, and question 49 is an essay agreeing or disagreeing with a statement. So these are common item types that you'll find within the PTE General writing tasks, particularly at the B level, as they reflect what the Common European Framework says people should be able to do at that level. So I said I wouldn't talk extensively about scoring, and I won't, but I wanted to just talk about scoring really because it does exemplify, again, the kind of top-down, bottom-up approach to writing. There are marks awarded for task engagement. Now, task engagement means the extent to which people answer the question. Okay, so the question is posed, and I mean, take for example here the review of a recent film. Okay, talk about the film, what you thought of it, and why you'd recommend that other students watch it. So task engagement means reading the question and engaging with the elements of it. So you may well write a review of a film, but the questions asked you to do 3 specific things: what you thought of it, why you recommend, well, describe the film, fine, what you thought of it, and why you recommend it. So that's task engagement. Task engagement is making sure that all the points that are asked for are addressed, okay? And the reason that is there is because the the task needs to be standardized to an extent, to ask for specific, to ask for general areas to be addressed, so that people write to the particular format asked for, and that can be then more easily processed really by the examiner. So task engagement is important. Formal requirements is important. Now, formal requirements means that you write the appropriate length of the test. So these are really test-taking strategies in a way. You need to make sure that you do engage with the task and you write the right number of words. The more linguistic focused traits, and traits are just things that we focus on in terms of the characteristics of the student's answer. You can see here, this is where the bottom-up processing comes in. Range of vocabulary and grammar, okay, very important. Accuracy, so using the correct words, using correct, appropriate grammatical forms, using grammatical forms accurately. Cohesion and coherence, so, and this is, we saw this earlier described in terms of the levels. At the lower levels, a lot of the cohesion and coherence comes from discourse markers, connectors between sentences and clauses. Whereas at higher levels, coherence and cohesion comes into paragraphing, topic sentences, referencing throughout the text. So there's different orders of cohesive devices and coherent devices, keeping meaning and also structure in the appropriate order. And similarly, orthographic control gets quite a lot of marks in the test in the PTE General. Again, that's paragraphing, appropriate punctuation, and spelling. So, and these are important because the impression that you get from a written text is because the written text is in front of you and you can analyze it and you can look at it again and again. There's a bigger impact in terms of error and in terms of misspelling than there is, for example, in speaking where somebody mispronounces something. And then there's another set of marks for how well you meet those criteria that we looked at earlier in terms of written interaction or written production. Again, all of these scales are based on the Common European Framework. So in terms of approaches and tips, I mean, this is more related really to how to address the exam. I mean, in terms of developing writing skills, we've looked at higher order can-do statements, we looked at course books, we've looked at developing vocabulary and grammar. When it comes to the test itself, of course, there are certain strategies you can use to make sure you get the maximum amount out of your performance in a test. These are things that students should pay attention to in terms of reading the instructions, making sure you address the task, as I said before, making sure that you have the right format. So read it. Is it asking you for a letter? Is it asking you for an essay? Is it an argumentative essay? If it's an argumentative essay, how are you going to organize that? Plan the writing. Maybe, if you need to, think of some keywords, key vocabulary that you're going to use in the actual answer, and that will help you in terms of getting a higher mark, a more appropriate mark in the test. And as I said, structure and vocabulary very important in writing. So using all the vocabulary resource that you have, and the language structures that you've been taught is very interesting. Check is very important. Checking is also important. So make sure that you check the word count. Make sure the content has been addressed, as I said. Make sure it's in the right format. Make sure the grammar, the spelling and punctuation is accurate, and make sure you've got the appropriate paragraphs and linking devices in the actual text. So those are the things, as I said, which will help to maximize a student's performance on the test. Okay, that's happy to take any questions based on that or questions related to PTE General.
Thank you, David. We've got some very, very good questions that have come through already. I'd remind everybody, if you do have questions, now is the time to type them into those chat panels and the question and answer panel, whichever you want. So a question from Alison. When it comes to the production of a formal, kind of formatted response, whether it's an email or a letter, students will typically write an address. They might write to a sentence subject, whatever it might be, at the start. Yeah. Is that included in the word count when examiners are looking at the word count?
A very good question. I think it isn't actually. So the answer to that is, I think it's, I mean, when you talk about an address, I suppose we're talking about, well, it depends if you do address 15 words or so. No, I don't think it's included. I think the word count is the body of the text.
Yeah, and I think that examiners will apply a degree of common sense when they're looking at this as well. And I think that that would certainly align with my understanding, David, that they would look at the body of the text the candidates produced. Good question from Sylvia. When you're talking about range in scoring for the written sections, what do you mean by range exactly?
Yeah, range is really the complexity. I mean, there's two different types of range. One is range of grammar and one is range of vocabulary. It just means the complexity. So, for example, I mean, if you're talking about grammatical complexity, then a simple sentence, a simple, noun phrase, verb, complement, that will be a simple sentence. Using a sentence which has multiple clauses or which has clauses, relative clauses, for example, that will be a sign of a higher degree of range. So more higher level students will use more complex languages, more clauses within that. So that's the basic difference. In terms of vocabulary, it's an interesting one, range of vocabulary, because of course in simplistic terms it could mean using more complicated or less common vocabulary. However, it also relates to idiomatic expressions. So, for example, high proficiency learners will know more idioms and things like phrasal verbs. So, even though phrasal verbs may look at their base level to be quite simple, depending on their meaning, they can be less common. So, the range of vocabulary means more complex words, but the reason for using a more complex word is because that makes the meaning clearer. It's not a case of using complex words for the purpose of doing so, but in a examination context, students should be told, don't just use simple sentences. If you can use more complex sentences and more complex vocabulary appropriately, then do so, because that's what the exam is looking for.
Thank you, David. A question from Marco. Does the marking and the way that the tests are marked in the written section stay consistent from level to level, bearing in mind the changes in CFR, or are there differences between levels in how the marking is done?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, as I said earlier, the marking scheme is based on the Common European Framework, and it's based on the descriptors of those different levels. And the marking scheme also, when you're interpreting the marking scheme level, the marker, the examiner, has to understand what the lower level performance would be and what the higher level performance would be. So say, for example, you're marking a level 2 exam, which is B1, then you need to be aware of what an A2 level of performance would be, what a B2 level of performance would be. Because when you mark, you give it the score which is relevant for that particular CFR level, or you say it's not at that CFR level and therefore it can be at the level below, or it's high in that CFR level, therefore it's close to the level above. So that's how the markers keep that level of consistency. So they're not just thinking of the performance that's in front of them, they're also thinking about what performance will be like at the lower level and the higher level. And then that allows them to focus on the criteria which are describing that particular level.
That's great. Thank you, David. We're getting lots of questions through. We will address them all. Lucy and Sylvia have similar sorts of questions. Is the name at the end of a letter or email important? If so, what side should it be on? And when writing an address in the heading of an email, are those necessary? So if you're writing an email, do you need to have that header line? Do you need to have an address if you're writing a letter? So really, when it comes to the formal conventions of a more formal piece of writing, what are the examiners going to be looking for there?
They are not looking for formal conventions. However, you are what's the word? It's good to advise students to use something that signals that you know the format of the response that you're being asked to give. So, for example, if it says write an essay about blah blah blah, and you start off with "Dear John, I'm writing to tell you about the party that I went to," then that's an inappropriate format. Okay, if it says write a letter and you say "Dear John," then immediately the linguistic marker is saying this is a letter. Okay, so your format, you have fulfilled that element of the formal requirements. So I would certainly advise students to use appropriate headers and footers because it signals to the examiner what the format of the writing is. Now, you don't necessarily need that if it's obvious from the response. So if you start your response, oh dear, no, if you start response, I read an article in the paper yesterday about some flying lessons. Do you want to come with me and go to the flying lessons? Then that fits. So you won't get you don't get penalised for not having headers and footers, but it should be clear from the writing that you submit that it fits the format that's been asked for.
Thank you, David. So Irene would like to know, do they lose marks if they write, for example, both British and American spellings, or British American words?
No. This is slightly more complicated than that, though. It's not a simple answer. Generally speaking, you do better if you write consistently in one particular variety of English. However, you won't be penalised. The impact, though, on the reader it will have an impact on the reader. So if the reader notices, now you're much more likely to be to have a negative impact by misspellings, misspellings, poor punctuation, than a different spelling of a particular word. So in a sense, the examiner is not looking at that detail, but they may notice it. Students are better advised, if they're going to use one particular variety, then use that consistently through the test, consistently through particularly the writing activity.
Thank you, David. And related to that, Lucy would like to know, when the marking is being done, how strict are examiners when it comes to spelling?
Yeah, they're pretty strict. So yeah, I mean, this is what I'm trying to get across really in this seminar. In certain elements of language use, then we're talking about communicative language use, and certainly within the writing interaction, the focus is primarily on whether that message was communicated effectively. But in the writing production, as you saw from that, grammatical accuracy gets a high number of marks, and also spelling and other conventions get a high number of marks. So it's very important that people check their work and make sure that as far as possible, they've addressed those spelling elements.
Thank you, David. A couple of questions around the word counts. How are those counted? The contractions count as one word or two words. How strict is that? Could you give us your perspective on that?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think the majority of issues, well, there's two issues with length. One is under length and one is over length. Now, underlength is not such a problem because for a start, underlength is almost immediately apparent because you can see that it doesn't meet the minimum word count. And underlength tends to also mean that the person has not really addressed all the content points. So an underlength answer, generally speaking, is going to lose marks in terms of the actual the task achievement, but also in other areas of the range and other areas. Overlength is more of a problem in that clearly somebody who's overlength can be a good writer, can be a person with a reasonable level of ability, but they're not following the task instructions. So overlength, again, the examiner will look at the text. If they think it's overlength, they will then count the number of words. They tend to count contracted words as one, not two words. Although saying that, in the written format, then you're less likely to see contracted words, but you will obviously see some. But anyway, generally speaking, they count it as one. Then there is published in the score guide the different levels. So if you're just a bit over, it doesn't matter. These levels are all described, the number of words. If you're significantly over, then you lose one of your format points, and if you're even further over, then you may get 0. So there are limits to the amount of overlength that you can have. Certainly, the problem with overlength is that it's unlikely you will then cover the points or have a well-structured piece of writing. So if your conclusion, for example, is way over the length of the text, then that's not going to be addressed by the marker. The marker will only address up to the highest end of the word length allowed. So it's very important to tell students to keep as far as possible to those lengths, and there is leeway, and we publish that leeway, but certainly significantly over length is not going to help the students in terms of getting a good mark.
Thank you, David. Question from Irene: are there some standard grammar points that gain marks?
No.
Nope. Good. Okay. That's a quick answer.
Just complexity of language.
More complexity, higher marks. Absolutely, that makes sense. Svetlana asks: does language register play a role?
Yeah, I think we saw that. I tried to point that out in the C level descriptor. So it's much more important in the kind of C level exam, which I haven't really dealt with in detail here. But certainly in the C level descriptor, it specifically says you should be able to write for different audiences. Less so for the B2 level. We saw the B2 level, it was writing a for and against essay or writing a review. So the actual audience is slightly less important. But at C level, it does come into the tasks much more.
Thank you, David. One last question from Alison. Some students have handwriting that's not fantastic. Can they use capitals, or will that affect their score?
No. Yes and no. Yes, they can use capitals, and no, it won't affect their score. However, of course, I mean, there will be some impact on the examiner in terms of the ability to read, and handwriting can be an issue, a problem. I fully appreciate that, and computerized testing does take that away a little bit. So that's certainly something. But in writing, as long as we still have writing in tests, then handwriting can be a problem, and I appreciate. But they can write in capitals, and it will not. It shouldn't affect their score. They should be judged on exactly the same criteria as everybody else.
That's great. Thank you, David. So those, I think, are all the questions we have time for. David, would just like to bring up that last slide.
Yes, certainly.
So yes, I mean, as David has been mentioning, we have been running this series of seminars. As I said at the start, these are being recorded, so if there's anything you missed, you can go back and rewatch those. We will send out the links when the series is finished. But please do, if you have the opportunity, join us again for my colleague Bartek, who'll be going over revision strategies tomorrow. And then into next week, some strategies for taking care of yourself and taking care of your students. Exams can be stressful, we all understand that. And I think there are some ways of approaching it that can certainly help. So Bartolome will be going through that early next week. I'd just like to say another thank you to David for a very engaging presentation. And thank you everybody on the call for keeping us company while we're in lockdown. I think it's been really interesting for me. I hope it's been interesting for you as well. And if there is anything that we haven't covered as part of this series, please do let us know. It's obviously designed to help you rather than just to keep us busy. So if there's anything that you'd like to see us do in the future, just let us know and we can look into that for you. Please, everybody, as I say, join us again tomorrow if you can. Take care of yourself. Have a very nice afternoon, morning or evening, whatever it might be in your time zone. And we'll see you again tomorrow, hopefully. Thank you again.